Since Christopher came up with an American example, I think it's also worthwhile quoting the American Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said that freedom of speech does not extend to the right to shout fire falsely in a crowded theatre. In other words, when your freedom of speech causes other people harm, you do have to think twice about whether you can exercise it. And I suppose at some point the authorities have the responsibility to ensure that freedom is exercised reasonably. It should have been. You know, it's easy enough to say that if something provokes a mob to violence, it's the mob that ought to be punished or prosecuted for violating the law and being violent. But then you get into the whole question of whether a certain offence was so grievous as to serve as a sort of extenuation for the outrage expressed by the mob. We've seen this in the satanic verses debate too.
Christopher?
Fire. Fire.
Well, you know he's saying it falsely, don't you?
No, well, two points about that. One is,
the only fire is at the
how
tip
do
of your
you
cigarette.
know how you could be just as liable to start a panic if there was a fire by shouting fire as you could, in fact more likely than you would be liable to start a panic if there was not, as I think I've just demonstrated. Justice Holmes's famous judgment, it seems to me, is one of the stupidest remarks ever made from the bench of the United States Supreme Court. And by the way, he made it in the following context. A group of Yiddish-speaking socialists who were opposed to Mr. Wilson's First World War, America's participation in the imperial bloodbath, gave out leaflets in Yiddish in New York saying, don't sign up for the war, don't believe in it, you're being led into a disaster. They were put in prison for life for producing leaflets in Yiddish, making a socialist case against the war. And the bloody fool Oliver Wendell Holmes had the nerve to say it was the equivalent of shouting fire in a crowded theatre where there was no fire. Of course there was fire. There was a bloodbath on the Western Front. That's a fire enough for anybody. So you shouldn't have used such a bullshit example.
Oh, all right.
Right. Okay.
Sorry, let me rephrase it. Your right to wave your fist stops just short of my face. How about that?
Well, the second thing is, as Mr. Lincoln once said, just as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. I don't claim the right not to be censored, I claim the right not to be a censor. I insist on this. The beliefs of the religious are very offensive to me. When I have to read in the newspapers that if I don't accept a bogus story about a supposed human sacrifice that took place in Jerusalem in something like AD 1933, if I don't accept this, I'm going to hell. If I don't accept this wonderful offer, I'm extremely offended. I think of all the cruelty and violence and misery and stupidity that's been inflicted by that. I do not go and burn down the nearest Baptist or Catholic church. I'd be ashamed of myself if I did. I don't call for people to form mobs to vindicate my hurt feelings. I don't do it. The Archangel Gabriel never said a word to the peasant Muhammad. Not a word. The event, as described, did not take place. I feel quite certain in saying so. Any more than the Archangel Gabriel announced himself to the non-Virgin Mary. I find it repellent to have to hear of people and the way they're treated who live under systems where that stuff is believed. It couldn't be more offensive to me. Who's ever going to say, well, if your feelings are hurt, Christopher, you're perfectly entitled to go burn down a newspaper or a house of worship.
Right.
How contemptible can you possibly get?
I want to take up this very point, which is the nature of offence, that something that gives offence is seen to legitimise violence. And the classic case that we're familiar with, all of us, is of the cartoons in the Danish newspaper, which appeared in the September, and only by the December of that year in Denmark had caused trouble across the world. 50 countries reproduced these cartoons, show that we all knew what we were talking about. But ambassadors were withdrawn from Copenhagen, and embassies around the world, Danish embassies, were attacked, and many people died because of cartoons. Can one just say, are a set of not very sophisticated cartoons worth a whole set of lives, Christopher?
Well, the principle certainly is, but here's what you have to understand. Picture, if you will, suppose you are a sensitive person wishing to live in a multicultural universe. And you think, well, I'll go out of my way if I have to. I'll bend over backwards not to do anything that will needlessly inflame a Muslim person. Suppose that was your wish, your desire. How could you possibly have known, if you'd made that resolution, that some caricatures, actually, published in an afternoon paper in Copenhagen, would lead to an international pogrom against a small Northern European democracy, with its diplomatic immunity violated, its embassies burned, the embassies of a democracy burned, I mean to say, by mobs in the capital cities of dictatorships like Libya and Syria, where demonstrations are not normally allowed, where suddenly the police don't show up, where people who look Scandinavian are attacked, where anyone who is Scandinavian is condemned and subjected to a boycott, a racist boycott, in fact, from Pakistan to Indonesia, where violence and intimidation are used against the press, where embassies of supposedly Muslim countries call upon the Prime Minister of Denmark to tell him what he's not legally allowed to do, that he must censor his own press, which is not in his ability to do. And where threats, in other words, are brought by the heads of states who claim to speak for Islam. Now, I don't know any Muslim who thinks that the ambassador of Egypt or Libya or Algeria speaks for Islam. There's no reason to think that these ramshackle dictatorships have any such right. The Prime Minister of Denmark certainly has no right to intervene in what is published in the press in Denmark. It's one of the most extraordinary cases of intimidation, and this against a country that devotes a sizable part of its budget to helping the Palestinian Authority, to sending peacekeepers and humanitarian workers to the Arab world, that had done its best to accommodate Muslim immigrants, that doesn't have an imperial past, that didn't invade Vietnam or bomb Hiroshima or any of the usual crap that you hear. No, it means that if whatever you do, they will find a reason to take offense. And when they've done that, they think it's their axiomatic right to go straight to violence of the most criminal kind, including, you represent the United Nations here, Shashi, for heaven's sake. Violations of diplomatic immunity, one of the most precious gains of human civilization. No, one has to oppose this 100%. It is intolerable, insufferable. It's enough concessions already that have been made. Has to stop now.